Welcome back. Today we are talking with Dr. Dan Radecki, co-author of Psychological Safety. Dan, lots of great information in parts one and part two here. I've got a question to ask you. How do we build a resilient brain?
Yeah, there's a lot of information and disinformation around that. Um, we attack it from well, of course, at the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership, we attack it from a brain-based perspective. And there's a few ways that we use to approach this, a couple different models. And all of it really is, think about what I said earlier, that PFC that you mentioned, that prefrontal cortex. Building brain resilience is really about maximizing your chance of being able to use that PFC at any given time. If I'm in a confrontation, if I'm under stress, how can I utilize that PFC and not just simply go to that fight or flight? Okay, the more I can use that and the longer I can use it, the better off I'll be. So we've got a couple ways we do this with the neuroscience research that's out there. One model that we have is called NETS, okay, NETS. And that is, we tend to think of it as sort of a long-term proactive approach to building brain resilience. It's almost like, getting the COVID vaccine and then boosters over time to prevent the effects of COVID. This is sort of a way that science, putting together the scientific research of how you build up that prefrontal cortex to make it strong, so that when you are under stress, and we're all going to be under stress, it's not a strategy just to say avoid stress. When you are under stress, you can manage it better. Okay. And NETS, probably some things that are intuitive, stands for nutrition, exercise, training, and sleep. And what we do is we dig into each of these domains and talking about, from a brain perspective, why it's important. So nutrition, for example, you've probably heard all about the ins and outs of the healthy diet. When nutrition, we focus on fasting, intermittent fasting, and the benefits that holds for the brain, and for the brain to literally clean itself out periodically. And there's some pretty interesting research about that with intermittent fasting. And I think this is one of the reasons intermittent fasting is becoming popular. It's becoming mainstream. Exercise, we all know exercise, how beneficial it is for our cardiovascular system, but it actually has physical effects on the brain. Growth chemicals that are released with exercise that almost act as housekeepers in our brain, cleaning out all the excess junk that's there from all the activity that goes on every minute of every day. So exercise is another one that's going to help maximize that prefrontal cortex, that PFC. Training, when I say training, I specifically mean mindfulness training. There's a tremendous amount of literature now around the benefits of mindfulness training. Societies have been doing it for thousands of years, and there's got to be a reason that it works. We're starting to find out, we think, why it works in part, and that is because of the fact that it literally strengthens that PFC. It makes it more, it makes the networks, the wiring, more resilient. So you can see physical changes in that PFC with mindfulness training. So that's another thing that we talk about. And the final one in that model is the sleep. It's something we take for granted these days. The average American gets a little less than 7 hours. But what we're finding the purpose of sleep is, and dreaming, is really for our brain to sort of make sense of everything we went through during the day. And that's important. We know, I used to work in a sleep lab. We know that if you sleep deprive people for an extended period of time, they will start to have hallucinations. They will go into a full psychotic episode. And then they'll just shut down. There's a reason you need sleep. And we think part of it is for that brain, that PFC, to figure out the stuff that was important during the day. Do I need to remember this? Can I forget this? And that's critical. And if you don't get adequate sleep, you're going to bog up that PFC so it's not functioning properly.
I like the mindfulness part that you talked. Well, I liked all of it, sorry. But mindfulness resonates because I've said it before on the show, I'm a practicing Buddhist. So I do a lot of meditation when I'm on the train, going to work, and it actually does calm you down as well. When you encounter instances that maybe you might otherwise fly off the handle, shall we say. It does help. It really does.
Oh, and that's actually one of the benefits of it within the realm of resilience, Alex, is that there's been research, Buddhist monks, practicing Buddhist monks who have done mindfulness training for decades, actually shown that the wiring between that PFC and that lower brain, that emotional negative brain, that PFC acts as a brake on that lower brain. It's much stronger in people, in these monks who practice mindfulness meditation as opposed to people who didn't. You can see physical changes in the brain with mindfulness training in that area. So it's a fascinating area of research.
Yeah, I've read some of it. For me, it's not the easiest thing to get through, but I have read some of it. Now, you mentioned this actually in the beginning of the first segment, where you only hinted at it, but you said triggers.
Yeah.
Managing our triggers. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. Yeah. So when we talk about triggers in relation to, well, let's talk about it in relation to psychological safety. It's those events that challenge the assumption of the world around us so that we can't make sense of it. And it's not what our brain wants in the moment. And that's where the safety model comes in. We see that those acronyms in the safety model as our triggers. So if I have a high need for autonomy and it's not being met, if someone is pushing me down and not letting me have control of the situation, that's going to be a trigger for me. And that's going to trigger my brain's stress response. And it's going to shut that PFC down and make me in fight or flight response. And so when we're talking about resilience training, it is to manage those triggers.
Now, TRAIN is actually one of your acronyms. So what does that stand for?
Train is another way. So NETS is sort of looking at building brain resilience in the long haul, proactively, right? With those acronyms. TRAIN is more about in the moment. TRAIN is when you're confronted with a situation, how you can manage your emotions so you don't have that fight or flight response. And you can maximize the chance of using that PFC. And TRAIN is basically a process that we use to look at how to do that in the moment. We train people on. TRAIN stands for, the T is trigger. Okay. So the first thing, I'll give you an example of this. You're in a Starbucks and you're late for dinner and you're waiting to pay and there's a long line of people, but in front of you, the cashier is just making idle chat to people. All right, just delaying the whole process. You feel yourself getting frustrated. You're angry. TRAIN is a way to manage that in the moment. So T, the trigger. What is it that's triggering me? I stop and reflect on this. Okay, I have a high need for autonomy. I know that's my trigger, right? My trigger is really being pushed now because this woman is taking control of the situation and she's going to control my dinner tonight because I'm going to be late. Okay, so I take a step back and reflect on that trigger. I can label that trigger. There's something called labeling, which just is naming the emotion, which helps your brain get out of that fight or flight mode and into more of a introspective mode. That's the trigger piece of it. And then the R is the reflection. Now that I can take a step back and I'm not in that emotional mood. And now the A in the model is appraise. I can reappraise the situation. So I can maybe look at the situation for what it is. Maybe this woman is not just trying to make idle chatter to make me late. Maybe this is the only time she has to talk to people in the day and she's lonely. Okay, this is helpful for her. This is appraisal. This is something that's very powerful for our brain. And the more you do it, the better you become at reappraising, right? And then the I in the moment is include. And that is now about that brain that wants to have in-group versus out-group. I want to bring this person towards my in-group. If I do that, it diffuses the situation more. And so if I've managed my trigger, I've maybe labeled it, I've reappraised the situation, now I can literally bring that person to my in-group, maybe try to find something in common with them, take their perspective. When I get to the front of the line, I can talk to them and see if I have something in common. Then once you can do all this, at the end is neutral. Now you can engage in a neutral approach. Your emotions aren't running wild because you have these faulty thoughts about someone who's trying to hijack your day. You see it for what it is on neutral territory. That sort of is a quick overview of the TRAIN, but we go into each one of those domains in detail to try to describe why it works and how it works and how to do it.
I found your example really interesting because I think so many people have experienced that.
Yeah.
And I've stood behind people in a line at Tim Hortons, a coffee shop,
Tim
and
Hortons, I love the Canadian
hey,
donuts.
there you go, Timmy's. And people in front are saying, "I wish that cashier would hurry up. Why is she talking to everybody, or why is he talking to everybody?" And then they get there themselves and do the same thing they just complained about all the other customers doing.
Yes. Yeah. So it really is about perspective. And I think, Alex, the nice thing about it, as we've been teaching this for years, is how people see this translates to their personal life and the ability to stop. And look, this is what I tell people. If the only thing you get out of anything that I teach you is to be able to challenge your own thinking, challenge your own assumptions about a situation like that, then that's a win. Because most of the people on this planet are walking around not thinking about their thinking. They just react. And if we could stop and reflect just for a second, it makes a huge difference. I mean, imagine a world where we were able to take someone else's perspective of, oh, I'm a Democrat, they're a Republican. Okay, I understand what you're saying. I can appreciate your perspective as opposed to it's me versus you. Because
Yeah.
then when that happens, you get to the in group versus out group, and we're in that lower brain and we're that dog barking and fighting. That's what it comes down to.
That seems to be one of the biggest challenges in society in general, an us
Yes.
versus them
Yes.
mentality in almost everything these days.
And what we say, again, our mantra is it's not you, it's your brain. It's not them, it's their brain. We know this is the way the brain is wired. It wants to very neatly categorize people as in group or out group. So that being the case, let's work on being able to push people into our in group more as opposed to the out group. And I that we have.
One last thing to ask you and talk about is psychological safety seems to have a relationship to strong networks and resilience. And then you had a couple of points about that too.
Yes, yes. So when we think about psychological safety and we try to get people to understand what's driving their psychological safety, we do it in sort of a concentric circle fashion. So you had mentioned earlier that resilience training, you can do a great job of it at an organizational level and a cultural level, but it really does come down to the individuals. You have to focus on the individuals first. So the way that we think about it is we train people to understand what's driving their psychological safety, to get to that point where they have that reflection, that aha moment of what it is that's important for their brain. And then with that in place, you can then focus on your relationships with others. You can focus on establishing a psychologically safe relationship with others. And then once you have that, you can then go out to having a psychologically safe team. And then with that in place, with multiple teams, you can do it on a cultural level. I think the problem we've run into today with psych safety is people trying to start with the team. And you're missing the boat because you can work on psych safety in the team, and that's what a lot of the publications are. But it's always going to suffer if you're not focusing on the individual first.
Why is that? Why can't you start at the team? And the reason I ask that is because there are so many organizations, the leadership and people in different groups, we have to build stronger teams. The focus is so much on teams. Yeah. Why is it on teams?
Yeah, and it's obviously the team is composed and only as strong as its individual members. And I think what we've seen is that when you're focusing on the team, a lot of times the onus, the burden is put on the leader. Okay, so I'm the leader. I need to make sure this team has psychological safety, and so I need to. And then the burden, the leader takes it over, and that's not sustainable. From what we found, that it's not a total responsibility of the leader for team psychological safety. We have to take that upon ourselves as well. So the individuals, once the individuals understand what their drivers are, what their needs are, and they understand what the other team's needs are and what their drivers are, then that's when And what I've seen, the magical stuff starts to happen where people start to feel like they can be vulnerable and they feel like they can empathize and take another person's perspective because they're seeing it for what it is. They're sharing with each other. Unless you have that as the starting point, I think it's hard at a team level to really get to that point. And in the teams that we've worked with many teams who have psychological safety. We've worked with many teams who don't. That's what we tend to see, that there hasn't been a focus on the individuals in those teams that don't have it. And then if you don't focus on the individuals, people feel marginalized. They feel like they're not being heard. It's just, you need to establish like a language and a common understanding. And that starts with the individual.
Does it just popped into my mind, does introvert or extrovert have anything to do with that?
Oh, yeah, I think so. I think that comes into the why of all of this. Introverts versus extroverts. We've done a lot of case studies or workshops with teams. And even though it's not, I haven't analyzed it anecdotally, I see a difference between the introverts and the extroverts in terms of how they approach this, what their needs are, but also their ability to be vulnerable. And there's nothing more gratifying than to see someone who initially is introverted and cautious about sharing, feeling guarded, and then getting to a point where they feel comfortable and opening up. It's actually, they become very emotional.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, about 3 minutes left. Do you have any final thoughts or ideas you'd like to share with us?
Yes, I think generally speaking, what I've seen for leaders is if you can model vulnerability, I think that is probably one of the best starting points. That's the definition of psych safety in a team. And if you as a leader, if you're going to try something, to be able to admit mistakes and actually ask for help, that's something that really goes a long way with people when you're trying to set this stage for other people being vulnerable too. So I think as a leader, modeling that, it's important. As an individual, with all of this, it's particularly about building resilience. I think, as I said earlier, we can just focus on getting to a point where we can reflect about our thinking, not take everything for granted, and try to be conscious about what we're doing. And you mentioned mindfulness. That's mindful. Being mindful of what you're doing can really go a long way to helping us use that prefrontal cortex and not just be a slave to that emotional brain, not be an autopilot.
We got a minute and a half left. Any idea what someone should do to get themselves started on this?
Yeah,
in case they are experiencing
yes,
some of these negativities, what can they do right away to make change?
Yeah, I think the reason we set up the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership and what we have online is a free assessment. You can take the assessment for free and get your highest domain. So you can take the assessment and look and see, out of those SAFET, which is my highest? That right there is a great starting point because it gives you something to work with in terms of self-reflection and maybe thinking about how you come off to other people, how you're seen in the world if you have this really high need for trust or for fairness.
I recommend everyone do that. And, especially leaders, because you're the ones who want all these resilient teams. Well, start with yourself first.
Yes.
As Dan said. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed all the ideas and the thoughts you had to share with us. And congratulations on the book, Psychological Safety.
Thanks, Alex. Appreciate it.
It's great. And we do have to give a shout out to Leonie Hull, the other co-author here. We can't let Leonie go without being referenced here.
Exactly. Yeah.
Otherwise, I'm going to get an email. So, Dan, thank you very much. Congratulations on the book. It was a pleasure chatting with you, and I'm happy to have you share your ideas with us today.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Great. Thank you. And everyone watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.